Good evening. My name is Cara McCarty. I'm the Curatorial Director at Cooper-Hewitt National Design Museum. And I want to thank all of you for coming this evening. It's such a gorgeous evening, and this event is being webcast live, but for those of you who are in the audience here, thank you so much for coming in on this very, very beautiful evening. Given that April is National Landscape Architecture Month, I think it's very befitting that we're having this month's program this month. And I also think it's very befitting that right behind us is one of the most beautiful parks in the United States, Central Park. I'm thrilled to welcome all of you to Cooper-Hewitt Design Center this evening. We opened the space last May to house the museum's education programs while the museum is undergoing a renovation at 2 East 91st Street. And we will reopen in fall of 2014 with 60% more exhibition space, more programming space, much better circulation, and a far better and very exciting visitor experience. So please be sure to put us on your calendar for fall of 2014, and you'll be hearing a lot more about that. We have already welcomed just over 10,000 people in this space. We opened May of last year, and we are very grateful for Target for underwriting this part of our whole On the Move venture. Tonight's conversation with Stoss Landscape Urbanism founder Chris Reed is part of an ongoing series started by the late Bill Moggridge, Cooper-Hewitt's former director who passed away last year. These programs are a way to promote dialogue about current issues in design and a chance for us to highlight some great practitioners working in various disciplines of design today. Past participants in the series included Robert Wong of Google, Chad Hurley, co-founder of YouTube, and many other luminaries. We are grateful to the Adobe Foundation for making this series possible. Those of you who knew Bill understand that these talks reflect Bill's curiosity about design and how designers think. Bill set these up so that the designer can present his or her story and way of thinking and working. In the same vein, Chris will present about Stoss, followed by a presentation by Elizabeth Cohen of Harvard, followed by a conversation with the three of us. Tonight's program is being webcast live and filmed and will be available on our website, cooperhewitt.org. I will introduce the two panelists who will then come up and give their presentation in order of this priority. NDA winner Stoss Landscape Urbanism is a Boston-based collaborative design and planning studio that operates at the juncture of landscape architecture, urban design, and planning. Chris Reed is a founding principal of Stoss, an adjunct associate professor of landscape architecture at the Harvard University Graduate School of Design. His innovative, hybridized approach to public space has been recognized internationally, and he has been invited to participate in competitions and installations worldwide. Reed's research interests include the impact of ecological sciences on design thinking and city-making strategies informed by landscape systems and dynamics. He is co-editor of an upcoming volume of research and drawing titled Projective Ecologies. Elizabeth Cohen is Dean of the Radcliffe Institute and Howard Mumford Jones Professor of American Studies at Harvard University. She is an expert on 20th century American social and political history and has authored many books and articles on the subject. Cohen's current book project, Saving America's Cities, Ed Loge and the Struggle to Renew Urban America in the Suburban Age, considers the benefits and costs of rebuilding American cities through the life and career of urban planner Edward Logue, who contributed to major redevelopment projects across the Northeast, including the New Boston that emerged in the 1960s. In addition to her scholarship, Cohen has made significant contributions to Harvard's institutional life since arriving in 1997 from New York University, including serving as co-chair with Mohsen Mostafavi, Dean of the Graduate School of Design of the Common Spaces Steering Committee. which proposed a Science Center Plaza, which you're seeing here, project that Chris has just designed and will discuss tonight. And I just want to mention that you are seeing this live. No one has ever seen this before, so this is very exciting, real life live streaming. May I invite Chris to the platform? Thank you.
Great, thanks, Cara. All right, thanks. It's great to be here. Great honor to be here. Great honor to be recognized with the National Design Award last year. It puts us in some really great company of some very thoughtful minds that have had some significant impact on how we interact with the world in many different ways. And so it was really wonderful. As part of that, you may know, we were all invited to the White House over the summer, where the First Lady hosted a luncheon for us, and it was a wonderful celebratory event. But the National Design Award winners have an opportunity to greet the First Lady prior to the lunch in a small room, so it's a one-on-one kind of thing. And I think we're all standing there kind of nervously as we're waiting for the First Lady. And one by one, each of the awardees went in and said to say something. And, you know, I think we all had in our head, you know, what we were going to say. I walk into the room, and the First Lady's standing there in the middle, and she immediately kind of opens her arms. And as I walk toward her, she gives me a big hug and kiss. And I almost fell apart at that moment. I could not utter a single word coherently after that. So I have what I said to the First Lady at that point. What I want to do tonight is really talk about the firm and our thinking, and then to really focus on two projects at different scales that I think embody the kind of thought that we bring to the table. In many ways, I founded the firm about 12 years ago, 2001, and in many ways the firm was born in part out of frustration, and in part because I had an ambition about something I wanted to do. I had worked for a number of years in a number of different practices, landscape practices that did fairly large-scale work and work in the public realm. And I always thought that as changes were made or changes were introduced, whether that was a political change by the administration that was overseeing the project, whether that was program changes within the project, whether that was even a kind of donor recognition kind of thing, there was always a crisis. Because a lot of the thinking that was going on in design firms at the time was purely about form and composition, right? And all the design had been worked out to such a degree at that moment that when change was introduced, it was really difficult for the project to cope with how to deal with the change. Because the new element on the table often didn't fit the kind of compositional arrangement that had been worked out. And it seemed to me that if you were working in the public realm, that there was an opportunity to develop design strategies that could more nimbly adjust to changes, still have a coherent set of principles, still be strong design, but could really respond to changing inputs, which I think in the urban realm is very important, given that projects take many, many years, even cities take decades to develop. The idea that we could set up strategies to allow for adjustment over time seemed very relevant to me. The ambition part of it was at the same time a set of discussions were emerging within landscape practice, within design generally, that really put landscape at the center of design thinking. One of the ways it did this was through what we now know as a kind of field that emerged called landscape urbanism. Landscape urbanism really draws on the kind of ideas inherent in landscape, change and growth and time, the fact that projects can be thought of through their operative and performative aspects in addition to their physical form. That projects can be thought of as engaging larger scale systems, and that projects really gave a lot of attention to a kind of thickened surface and activation of time, and that fully engaged these ideas about flexibility, open-endedness, and adaptability. And so it's really with this in mind that I started out on my own, as a way to think through how is it that I can start a practice that really tested some of these ideas in the real world with real clients and real projects. In this way, the firm is a bit speculative, it's a bit experimental. On the one hand, I'm very much interested in practice in cities in multiple formats, whether it's a kind of horizontal city like Phoenix or Los Angeles, whether it's intensely developed cities like New York, like Hong Kong, like many of the emerging cities in Asia, or whether it's cities that are shrinking or changing in different ways, where industry and manufacturing have moved on. All of these, for me, become the center of where I want to be working. As much as I'm interested in practice, I'm still interested in research, both in the firm and alongside it. I'm particularly interested in ideas about ecology that have emerged within the past, say, 30 years, where ecological thinking has shifted from this understanding of ecosystems that try to achieve a steady state to ecosystems that are constantly in a state of change, adapting to circumstance, adapting to different conditions. And it's really through these ideas, through this work that emerged this book project that Cara mentioned with Nina Marie Lister, where we're as interested in how ecological thinking has influenced design discourse as we are in the various ways designers are coming to project these ideas through their own work. And so this is some work that we've done at school, looking at dynamic modeling systems, work that we've done in an office which says that a project, this is some drawing work that we did on a park, but the idea that the park doesn't always stay in one state, that it can shift over time depending on various environmental or even administrative inputs, sea level rise, climate change among them. And so these are some of the ideas that we're trying to capture in the emerging book project. And my third foot is then in teaching as well, and teaching becomes a way to bring ideas to the table that we're able to explore with students. I think it's particularly important to note that the work that we're doing in the core right now at the GSD is really asking landscape architects to be urbanists and to lead some of these large-scale urban projects. It's interesting that you mentioned the park behind us. Charles Waldheim, a colleague of mine, has just released an essay where he traces the use of the term landscape architect. And while Olmsted in North America was the first person to use it, it wasn't in reference to this project. It was in reference to a project where he was hired to essentially lay out and design northern Manhattan from, I think, 155th Street north. It was an urban project, it wasn't a park. And I think that's significant. A lot of the work that I'm doing, that we're doing at school, is really aimed at kind of recapturing this kind of central role for landscape architects within the field of urbanism. The firm itself has worked in a couple different ways. We've used limited design competitions as a vehicle for us to explore some bigger ideas that on projects that maybe there wasn't a client willing to hire us right out of the box to do. One of the seminal projects that came out of my office early was this project for the Lower Donlands in Toronto, where we began with this idea of how is it that you restore a river? How is it that you rejuvenate a river and all the ecologies that go along with this? And so for us, the ice cream truck kind of soundtrack is pretty good, huh? This is what urbanism is, right? So for this project, the idea was, how is it that we research in this case, the breeding habits of fish, begin to think through what are the performance requirements of the fish, use that to structure out a very dynamic floodplain, and use that then to structure out a city. So a city really built on the back of very richly dynamic ecologies. This large-scale work is really part of the bigger ambition of the firm. But at the same time, we do smaller scale work that engages a piece of these agendas one at a time. There's a little project in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where we were very much, even at the scale of 1/3 of an acre, this is a tiny, tiny project, we're interested in engaging some of the larger scale environmental dynamics that were available to the project, going on around the project, but had really been denuded. And so this was about how to reutilize waste resources, stormwater that was being let off into the river, how to activate flooding cycles within the context of a public space. Part of that strategy involved lowering the grade behind this wall to allow for flooding for the river, and to allow for the reestablishment of this native marsh on the edge of the third ward here. So even at the small scale, how is it that you activate ecological dynamics? And how is it that some of those same ideas can translate into the way social spaces are designed? We're very much interested in ideas about open-endedness and flexibility, and how engagement with form, even form that may be unfamiliar, really catalyzes a sense of discovery and response in people to begin to inhabit public spaces in different ways. And of course, kids are really, really good at doing this. Okay, so with that as a frame, I want to really show you two projects. The first project is a competition project again. We're very good at losing competitions. We take second place a lot. In fact, Nina Marie Lister, the ecologist we work with, she and I were talking one day. I said, we have enough projects now to make a book, non-winning second place projects. We'll call it Second Place or something. And she said, no, we're just going to call it Loser. For this project was pretty interesting. This is the center of Minneapolis, and this is the Mississippi River. From this waterfall down is the Mississippi River that you probably know. It's the big floodplain river that goes all the way down to New Orleans. From the waterfall up is this other river. It's called the Prairie River, and it's got natural embankments. It's a much smaller scale river. And it's pretty engaging. What we were asked to do is to look at 6 miles of riverfront here and to begin to think about a landscape and park strategy that would be a catalyst for new kinds of urban development. I love this kind of people, the city. And so these are some of the images from the site when we went there on a very cold January day. Some of the sites have been abandoned, some were active, but it was a huge stretch of river. And part of our thinking was, you can't do this all at once. You can't just conceive a big master plan and think that it'll just happen. So there are a couple questions, and you also can't do it by thinking of just one green band along the river is going to really rejuvenate this entire area of North Minneapolis. And so for us, it became a question of how to thicken the agenda and how to think through the how as well as the what of what we were proposing. So for us, the project became about a set of working ecologies and ecological systems and dynamics that would be put to work to clean and to reconstitute this working riverfront, and to guide a longer-term transformation of the city. wasn't about a single line or a simple open space, but about multiple strands, multiple threads, working operational landscape infrastructures that could infuse and invigorate the city. And the project was really made up of a whole series of what we would call hybrid park infrastructure or city strands, each with a distinct role and character. The biggest was the river park, or what we were calling the working fields, this idea of how to transform the former Portlands along the waterfront into a new kind of working park, a productive park. Here the idea was to use the stormwater from an adjacent neighborhood that was just being piped into the river and polluting it, to redirect that water and use that as a catalyst for ecological and social reoccupation of a number of these sites. The way this worked is illustrated here. The idea was we could go into any one of the sites that were immediately available, begin to look at how to clean up the soil, including a series of phytoremediation strategies that could be put in place. Those trees harvested over time, planted over, and gradually a set of mixed forest type of installations could emerge. That same strategy was a kind of holding strategy. In part, this was a landscape remediations were put together and things were coordinated. The channel system could be cut in portions of the park to begin to take in the storm water, and a whole series of new kinds of ecological habitats would begin to grow both within the park and along the riverfront. Over time, that strategy again could be expanded flexibly along the riverfront. Other pieces of the project could be put in place, infrastructures for connection both through the park and across the river, and other kinds of recreational and even cultural uses could be added in over time. The whole idea was to give a nod, in a way, to both the ecological and working legacies of this riverfront. Across the river, we developed a series of botanic overlooks as ecological cyborgs. Here we were very interested selectively on a number of sites in utilizing the waste heat from a nearby power plant, redirecting that to begin to power a series of new hot tubs, swimming pools, greenhouses, and community centers within the neighborhood as a catalyst. In this way, we could create these exotic botanic gardens with steamy pools set within the kind of more native context of the riverfront, and set up a whole new series of relationships with one's environment. Powered by the steamy mist here, that same strategy could then be deployed across the entire, that stretch of waterfront to begin to rejuvenate neighborhoods there. There's a video of this online. If you look it up, Stoss, you can find a Vimeo. There's a great soundtrack under this. The soundtrack that they laid under this piece of it is a little funky. It's got some good beat to it. It kind of makes me sound like a pimp when I talk, but it's in some ways kind of appropriate. That whole strategy was then interlaced with a series of new social infrastructures. We're collaborating with Michael Maltzahn out of Los Angeles, as well as a very large team of engineers and economists and ecologists. Michael helped develop a whole series of bridges across the rivers that became destinations in and of themselves. So thinking about infrastructure not merely as a connection, but as a social destination itself. All these were enhanced by a series of extensions into the city, and an energy forest here along the highway that became an air cleanser, a carbon sink, an energy generator, and across the river a series of sporty circuits along a reconstituted rail corridor. for sweaty bodies and industrious play. Project also included a series of new urban occupations, a live-work district where industrial uses were overlaid with, not displaced by, residential and commercial uses, and the City Islands River Orchards, a series of working gardens and orchards as a lower density but concentrated form of development. City living in a working park on an island in the river, engaged with cultivated ecologies and environmental dynamics. For the project, we developed a flexible implementation strategy which could respond nimbly and opportunistically to conditions on the ground. It was built off existing land resources, ownership patterns, infrastructures, and designated high priority sites. It leveraged underutilized and waste resources. It found efficiencies in collaboration and cross-fertilization between urban and environmental systems, and it built new synergies between work, public life, and the landscape fabrics that support them. In all, the project stakes new claims, it seeds new growth, it broadens the river's reach. This, for us, is the next generation of working landscapes and of a landscape-based urbanism at the very large scale. So that project, in some ways, was a recent extension of some of the thinking of the Toronto project that I showed earlier. The next project, and the project that Liz is here to help talk about, is a brand new project. It's like this baby, just emerging even this afternoon. This is a project at Harvard in the city of Cambridge on a piece of campus that exists at an important urban and university knuckle. It's a project that we began a few years ago, but Liz has been working on for, 5, 6, 8, 10 years? It's been a while, so she's been working on it much longer than us. And it's a project that'll be formally inaugurated by President Faust at the university on Friday at 1. So if you're around Cambridge, you're welcome to come. If not, we can give you a live feed, which you were watching as you walked in, and can watch the festivities. So this is a new project, and I haven't quite figured out how to talk about it yet, so it's a little bit raw. The project sits just north of Harvard Yard and just adjacent to CERT Science Center here. What you can see, it also sits adjacent to this fountain designed by Pete Walker when he was with SWA. This is the Tanner Fountain. But the site is primarily that crisscross series of lawns in the center of the upper photograph. You can see that the condition of those lawns is really quite poor. You can see that there's not a lot of stuff out in the middle of that lawn, except for one linear row of concrete benches. It was a space that was in pretty poor shape when we got to it. And it was a space that the university wanted to turn into the center of campus life going forward. It's a tricky site too. Not only is it adjacent to one of America's most historic spaces and landscapes, it's also on top of a piece of road infrastructure. And in fact, it's the failure of the infrastructure that led to the project itself. The waterproofing membrane of that tunnel had given way after about 30 years and had to be replaced. And so the university was taking advantage of the fact that the site had to be torn up to then design a new space to go back on top of it. This is a kind of 3D view of that space. You can see the cars going underneath the tunnel. That's the science center there. Not only did we have the complexities of the tunnel infrastructure and the waterproofing to deal with, we also had a site that was absolutely laced with infrastructure that serviced the city. So things generally running in this direction are city utilities, but also infrastructure that kept the university up and running including a fairly significant steam tunnel here. And so what that meant is there wasn't much space to build anything. They couldn't put structure or foundations down, couldn't put a lot of planting down. So technically it became a very, very complicated project. As I said before, it sat at this knuckle. Just to the south of that is Harvard Yard. Just to the north of that is what's become known as North Campus, where a lot of the science buildings are, and a series of museums. It's an incredible crossroads. It was. I think because of the tunnel condition, the site tends to funnel everybody moving north into campus and from Harvard Square down here to a series of residential neighborhoods up there, funnels all those people through the site. So it very much, when we encountered it, was a crossroads, but there was no reason to kind of sit and hang out. Again, also had this underlay of automobile traffic and an overlay of bicycle traffic. So you had these multiple levels of different kinds of movement going on. And for the university, the idea was to take this and rejuvenate it, really turn it into a very active space that could foster a new set of social relationships on campus. On the one hand, the program was pretty intense. We were asked to develop a project that could be utilized as a flexible event space for any number of events and activities. And part of the work that we had was to begin to think through how is it that these different activities could be layered on top of one another, and so that the space could be utilized in many, many, many different ways. It included it included the accommodation of a very, very large tent that was used for a number of alumni events and other kinds of performances. And with eventually through the design process, in fact, we set up a foundation system that could accommodate a whole series of different sizes of tents for different kinds of activities, and into which you could plug the foundations for other kinds of temporary structures as well. And so there was this program that was pretty intense, very, very heavily programmed. But on the other hand, the idea was to accommodate the everyday as well. How is it that it becomes an attractive space for people just to hang out during their workaday lives, have lunch, meet a friend, those sorts of typical and spontaneous activities which were fully absent from the space. And a lot of that had to do with how to begin to think through the clustering of people and where we might begin to accommodate people in different ways, even on an everyday level. On the surface, the project's really quite simple. It's a bunch of pavers and some benches. That's pretty much it. The pavers are distinctly bright, and the whole idea here was to mark this threshold between Harvard Yard on the south and the North Campus, whereas the lawn and path configuration that you saw before really extended the design vocabulary of Harvard Yard across this tunnel. What we proposed was something different, create a threshold that really provided a break physically and psychologically from the activities that were happening in the historic yard and what could happen out here. The pavers are very simple, but quite nice. They're 12 inches wide by 3, 4, 6, or 9 feet wide. And they're concrete with a custom mix of both stone aggregate, which you see as dark pieces, and also porcelain. It turns out that the paver manufacturers about 20 miles from Kohler, Wisconsin, where all your toilets are manufactured. And so we were able to take the waste product from the toilet manufacturing process and use that as part of the aggregate here as well. The paving pattern is designed so that there's a very specific relationship between the pavers and the benches. Every time you have a bench, there's a reverberation within the paving pattern here. A lot of the photographs you're seeing here obviously are the project in construction. This was about a week and a half ago, with the plaza really quite dirty from construction activity. One of the challenges with this project is we couldn't shut down the project, and so circulation had to continue, but the university was also interested in keeping activity going during the construction process. At one point, there was a ice skating rink for about 3 months during the winter. Here's where we think about accommodating the everyday and accommodating flexibility even at the scale of the human body. The benches are custom designed as a family to really accommodate different body types and different moods in different ways. So sometimes, you want to go out there and sit properly and read a book. Sometimes you just want to lounge and hang out. Sometimes you have a body type that's different than mine, and we're each going to find a different comfortable place. So rather than a standardized bench that everybody has to kind of fit into, we developed a whole series of benches that could accommodate people in different ways, all built out of a similar design vocabulary with a series of wood ribs. This is a small model prototype for the bench. And then what you see here are photographs from the fabrication shop where they're prototyping the bench. You can see the lighting effect where the benches are going to glow at the bottom. And this is one of the first benches installed on site with two of our clients, Lisa Hogarty, VP for Campus Services on the right, Mark Johnson, VP for Capital Projects and Planning, and this is one of the guys from my office. That was the same prototype bench a couple months ago. The benches have been coming to the site, being installed and then being wrapped in plastic that was being referred to earlier. The benches are arranged, again, to create choice and difference. The idea that you might, at some moments, choose a place that's very social, like here in the foreground, and at other times you might want a place that's a little shadier, a little quieter, a little off the main path. The benches are also arranged here to accommodate that larger tent. But here you can see how the benches in a cluster along an edge and an end really work in conjunction with the tent or fountain as creating a whole series of different subspaces across the site. And the idea was to really take this site to transform the idea of purely a crossroads to a space that gave people a reason to want to linger, to want to stop, to want to hang out. So here you see again some of the benches as they've emerged in the last few days. This is a photograph from today. Just this afternoon, they opened half the site, and students started using them in many of the ways that we had started to anticipate, which is pretty cool. This is pretty fun. There are a series of other bench-type walls as well. When the benches were being asked to do more things than just accommodate seating, they shifted to a custom concrete. The two at the middle are positioned to help with wayfinding. In fact, the one that's pointing here towards CERT building here in the foreground accommodates a stainless steel panel with a campus map. It's also hooked up with a whole series of utilities for many of the events that are going to take place here. That vocabulary is extended to the two end walls, which again have a lot of work to do. They contain the space. They're also engineered to sustain a truck moving at a certain speed, banging into the wall and making sure it doesn't then fall off the edge onto the traffic below. But those walls also perform a wayfinding function, and then they've been in some ways domesticized to allow for seating, to allow even for the parking of bikes within the center of the plaza. At one end of the plaza, the wall opens up so that you have views out to the nearby common. It also is the one moment you get an opportunity to just see the traffic that's below. I don't think this ever came up in our discussions, but this was my secret agenda, to have one moment where you could really just enjoy the traffic that was moving beneath you. It's great too, because when you sit there not facing it and leaning back on it, all you hear is the white noise of the traffic, and it's really pretty compelling. This is the other end where those same metal bars kind of pop out to accommodate bicycles, so that the kind of normal activity of the campus is really accommodated right in the center. Again, these are some of the different layers of infrastructure that were put in place, foundations to accommodate the tent. The whole surface really becomes a plug and play. So even though it looks simple, there are all these foundations that you simply plug a tent, plug some other kind of structure into. It's wired, there are power outlets, water outlets, anything you want to do, you can simply plug into the surface. It also does other things like deal with stormwater. The city was absolutely adamant that no drop of water would penetrate the surface because of the waterproofing membrane. And so water's redirected to either side, and in fact, when it goes north, it's utilized for irrigation for some of the planting areas to that side. This whole edge of the plaza is the one place we could really plant. And so the planting strategy here consists of this inhabitable grove along the kind of blank wall of the Science Center. It's made up of multi-stem ginkgo trees, which don't exist in real life. They've actually been planted to grow in a multi-stem format, interspersed with staghorn sumac, and so you get this very dramatic kind of yellow-red thing happening in the fall. Interestingly enough, staghorn sumac is a plant material that grows along highways. So for us, it's kind of a nod again to the kind of infrastructural function of the space. And it also creates this other kind of space set back a little bit from the main plaza space. It has a much different scale and feel to it. This is the sumac. Sumac goes in at about 3 feet. Our construction manager keeps referring to it as sticks. What are the sticks that are out there? That sumac will grow into a fairly robust red grove easily within 2 years. And so the project, for us, is this exciting project. On the one hand, it's about reactivating space and creating this new center for campus life. It's about how do you create a flexible public space, both at the scale of the event and the congregation, but also at the scale of the human body to allow for choice and flexibility. And on the other hand, it's this highly technical project that deals with both an array of existing technical conditions that had to be dealt with, plus an overlay of new infrastructures that we were bringing to the site that allowed for some of these other activities to begin to play themselves out. And so in this way, it does in some ways tie into some of the ambition of the bigger work. It certainly plays with some of the larger scale infrastructural systems that are in play, circulatory systems that are in play and at work on this site. I think the work in general will account for any number of changes, be it political, administrative, or otherwise over time. Certainly this kind of space or a larger scale urban strategy like Minneapolis can be responsive and adaptive to changing inputs over time. It's built on principles of interrelationships where cities and projects can assume multiple states, where multiple occupations and outcomes are possible. And in that way, it really kind of strikes at the core of some of what we're trying to do, both as landscape architects and urbanists. Thanks. Yeah, it's totally cool.
Good. I thought it'd be fun while I'm talking if we keep the live stream on. This is very exciting for us after all this time of seeing this on paper to actually see people in this space. So I want to first thank Chris and Cara for giving me the opportunity to talk to you about this project from the perspective of the client. So I will share some context for Chris's work, he being the architect, I speaking from the Harvard perspective. So let me first give you a little bit of background on the project. During her first year as president, Drew Faust decided that one of the big problems at Harvard was that we were a very fragmented campus. We call, in Harvard lingo, we talk about tubs. A very unwelcoming campus where the message we learned as we studied it more was don't stop, don't talk, keep moving. There was no place to sit. There were no benches, no chairs. Just keep going and doing what you're here to do in a very sort of narrowly defined academic way. So one of her first acts in the spring of 2008, she was inaugurated in the fall of 2007, was to appoint a committee that we called the Common Spaces Committee that was co-chaired by me and Mohsen Mostafavi, the Dean of the Graduate School of Design. And our task was to try to figure out how to create more common spaces on the Harvard campus. There really was a crisis in social sort of non-academic spaces. And that had led to really the privatizing of social life in what are the Harvard version of fraternities called finals clubs. There were houses, there's a long tradition since the 1930s of Harvard students living in residential houses, but those really are limited in their what they can accomplish, and they're not very inclusive. People are assigned to houses. They're not spaces that are open to everybody. There also was a real problem in the communication of programs and events broadly. There was a lot of talk of what we call One Harvard, but very few spaces that were devoted to One Harvard. Everything was very, as I said, very fragmented in houses, in schools, in buildings that were very independent, and very few places that brought people together. And it wasn't just a problem for the undergraduates, though there was certainly a lot of attention to that. We also needed community spaces for staff, for faculty, and for graduate students. We did focus groups with a variety of different groups on campus, and I think some of the most compelling testimony, the most upsetting testimony, came from graduate students who already live a very focused life, a very pressured life around getting through the program, creating a dissertation, getting a PhD, and many of them said, I got here from an undergraduate experience where I felt part of a place, and I've been looking ever since for Harvard. Where is Harvard? I don't feel part of anything here. So we were very aware of this, and we were aware, though, that what we needed was a campus center or campus centers, not a student center. We really needed places that would bring people together across these divides. So we established a committee of about 25 stakeholders. Undergraduate and graduate students were included, faculty, administrators in relevant areas. We visited other campus centers. We went to ones in the Boston area, to Wellesley, to BU, to MIT. Some of us went out further afield. I went to Princeton and looked at their new campus center, not so new anymore, I think it may be 10 years old. And then we went about interviewing firms to do a plan for common spaces, and we ended up hiring the firm of Max Skogan, Merrill Elam Architects, and they worked with Michael von Wackenberg as the landscape architect. And we worked very closely with them over a year. Mac and Merrill had actually done the Wellesley Campus Center. We were very impressed with that. They were dealing with some similar issues. And we worked with them, so as I said, for about a year, and they did a lot of analysis in the process of trying to figure out what we needed, how to solve these problems. And it included doing a lot of mapping of how people were moving through space on campus. And they came up with a very powerful analysis that we really had, that identifying a spine, if you know the Harvard campus, that went all the way from the north, from what we call the Radcliffe Quad, to the river. And so there was a long spine, and along that spine, we identified places that we felt we could bring people together. And what became clear as we did this mapping and we talked to people and we thought about what made sense, that this area outside the Science Center was, as Chris said, a real crossroads between the main Harvard Yard campus, the law school, which is right beyond here, to the north, the Science Center itself, where I went by this morning to check on the latest, before I got on the airplane, and I heard a tour guide saying 10,000 students or 10,000 people go in and out of those doors every day, and many more than that cross this space. Museums, the freshman commons, and so forth. Everybody feeds into this space. And as you saw in those pre-pictures from Chris, it was a very poorly maintained, poorly designed area, scrubby grass, broken and varied pavements. It was really an embarrassment. The only time it actually looked good was when those alumni tents were up at commencement. So what we realized that we needed, this was a really prime location for us. What was also very clear early on was that we did not have, nor did we really want, a big open field somewhere to put up a new building. First of all, there were no big open areas. Second of all, we didn't have the money to do that. But third of all, we really wanted to preserve the sense of Harvard being an urban campus. And so the urbanism that Chris has been talking about was very much in our minds. And so in the end, we identified two spaces, the Science Center here and Holyoke Center, which is, I don't know how familiar you are with Cambridge, but which is now a major administration building, and then the downstairs is just kind of open to the public. There are some stores, restaurants in there, but it's not really used as part of campus. Those were the two sort of chief intervention sites that we wanted to embrace. But we wanted to try to, and the Holyoke attraction was to have our campus, the place where we would have most of the kind of hanging out, eating, lounging, whatever, in an interior, that it would be in the city of Cambridge, that the students, we wouldn't be creating an alternative to Harvard Square, we would be, connecting the Harvard campus with Harvard Square. I should point out that the original plan for the Science Center, we're only halfway there, but very happily halfway there, was that there would be interior renovation in the downstairs, the opening space. We would reconfigure the way the Science Center itself was organized, and there's a library that's actually the first use that you enter when you enter the building. We would move that around and have lounging and eating spaces adjacent to this plaza. Now that we're not there yet, but so in a sense we started with the plaza, and hopefully we will expand into the interior. So all this was sort of thought about. This plaza was to be a site for not only a major gathering space, but for formal events, the reunion tents I mentioned, class assemblies, film showings, performances, and so forth. All these, we had great ideas, it was all very exciting, and then the Great Recession hit. And there was no money to to implement any of these elaborate plans. But then we had a real good fortune, which was the leaking underpass, or overpass. That was really a gift to us. The original plan was that we couldn't possibly do anything at the plaza, but we would, because the city was going to be opening it up, we would just install the infrastructure that would be needed for when we had the money to do this. So there was a fair amount of discussion about, well, what would we need down the line? And at a certain point, fortunately, the decision was made to take advantage of the moment and actually to go ahead with the project. And that was a very important decision, and we still don't have a donor. There are donors on the horizon, but the university decided this was so important, and it was really going to be the first opportunity we would go ahead and do it anyway. But and then we had interviewed a number of landscape architects, and very happily hired Chris, Reed, and Stoss to do the job. And the point I want to make here, just in giving you this history, is that when Chris finally got to, oops, did I do something to that? Want to just, oh, I don't know, maybe it's, okay. When Chris did get this job, he had a very big burden in that we had all of these hopes and expectations, and he was faced with having to try to make his project carry the burden of all of these hopes and expectations. So we were not, it's one outdoor space, we weren't even getting the interior space, and somehow he was to make this space work for all the things we hope to accomplish, and really be a year-round space for social engagement. And in fact, in his original plan, there were, of course, as usual, evolutions along the way, but the original plan had the benches, he captured the steam from those, and he can tell you more about how he was going to do this, the steam from these steam tunnels underneath the plaza that were going to create warmth that would fill the space. It was really quite beautiful, these designs he did of it, and it would also warm these benches, which originally were going to be Corian. They eventually became wood, as you saw. But anyway, so he was thinking about how to make this space that could be used all year round. So that's one sort of big point. The other big point I want to make is that this was a very fascinating experience for me to watch, because I'm an historian and I'm a more traditional academic. Now I'm a dean, but I was then professor of history. And I was not used to having to work the way Chris had to work, which was to be basically a negotiator, mediator, among many factions who were stakeholders in this project. And I have to say, I came away from it with tremendous admiration for what a designer faces. A negotiator, a politician, a person who can work with people with very diverse interests. It was really quite fascinating to watch. And just to outline to you what some of the different constituencies were, there were designers who were in our client group and who were weighing in, who cared only about the design, wanted it to be beautiful, wanted it to be cutting edge, wanted it to be risk-taking, and so forth. Then there were people like me who were concerned that our common spaces goals to create a space for interaction across the campus would be accomplished here. I also was very concerned about the communication side, that we wanted there to be a place here, and we're still kind of working towards this, where events could be publicized, where we would send messages that you're all part of one Harvard. There were administrators who were concerned only with keeping the budget to the original cost that had been, expected, that the keeping to the budget at all costs, and when the costs inevitably climbed, their choice was that we limit the scale and the scope of the project in order to keep within the budget. Those of us who had other ambitions wanted to keep accommodating our original intentions and, if necessary, spend more money. There were administrators who were vying for influence over the project, and then there were fundraisers who wanted designs that would appeal to donors, whom we were seeking throughout this project. So Chris was dealing with an awful lot of different ambitions for the project, and he was also dealing in general with very conservative set of attitudes about what public space on a campus like Harvard should look like. So remember that right over here is the Harvard Yard, going back to the 17th century, considered a sacred space by many people. So there was a lot of concern about what would be right over those fences. and innovative design did not sit very well with people. In fact, there were a number of people pushing very hard for traditional park benches. They thought, what are those things that Chris is promoting? There also was a lot of fear of riffraff from the city who would be attracted to these benches. You could lie on those benches. Oh my God, we're going to be filled with, people, homeless people from Harvard Square. The same thing had happened when we put chairs in Harvard Yard. A common space is when the budget crisis hit, we wanted to go ahead and do something. So we bought very inexpensive colored chairs and filled Harvard Yard with them, and they've been a tremendous success. People told us, oh my God, you're going to have everybody and, every homeless person from the greater Boston area on those chairs. Well, that has not happened at all. And, again, it's one of these situations where you're going to, deprive most people of the experience because a few people might, create problems. And the only problem we had with the chairs, and we will have, the same thing will happen. What Chris didn't perhaps convey to you is that those tables and chairs that are over by the grove there, that will also be interspersed and movable in this space. So there'll be additional seating that will be available. And so, again, I think probably the toughest thing we'll face will be students walking off with some of the chairs, which we dealt with in the other place by having amnesty moments when we would then allow them to return them, or we had people go into the dorms and look for them. So finally, let me just say in conclusion that I think the test of the success of this plaza won't just be the design. The design is, I think, going to be spectacular, and we're already seeing students using it. It will also be the ongoing programming that will take place in this space. It'll be important that we make a lot of things happen, that there be food trucks and art and films showings and ice skating rinks and tents and films and so forth. We need to keep it dynamic. We also have to be sure that we keep it supervised and safe, in good condition, with good lighting, and so forth. And I think the other thing is that we really this is a chance to hopefully return later to the interior space in the Science Center, make that work in relationship to the outdoor space. But we have a chance now to see what do we really need on the inside that will complement what Chris has so beautifully designed on the outside. So that's my comments, and now we can discuss it.
Well, thank you very much, Chris and Elizabeth. It was really fascinating to hear a case study of two very, very different projects, very different scales, very different types of environment. And I want to congratulate the both of you for succeeding. And it'll be fascinating to see how this space, the Harvard Science Center space, will be used over in future years. And it made me, as I was sitting there listening both to Chris's presentation as well as to Elizabeth's descriptions as the client, as a designer, what type of design skills and management skills are called upon for this type of project, for these type of projects, because surely you must need to build large teams of people. And did you ever think that you would have to have this type of management as you were studying landscape architecture?
Yeah, no, it's not something you learn in school. This role of the negotiator I'm realizing is really strikes right at the center of it. I mean, in addition to some of the university stakeholders that you were talking about, we also had to deal with the city of Cambridge, of course, and the plaza is technically, because it's on the top of a tunnel that spans a road, is technically a right-of-way that's governed by the city of Cambridge. And so there's this kind of co-ownership of that space that had to be negotiated. And a tiny fraction of the space also existed within the Cambridge Historic District, whatever the historic district is that was around Harvard, so I had to go through a whole series of reviews as well. And so, we're having to think through how is it that we allow all of these different agendas to be put on the table? How is it that we start to sort through them and look at the technical aspects, the social aspects, the design aspects, the regulatory aspects, and really figure out how to create something that's really both quite elegant on the one hand, but also quite usable on the other hand. I think so much of the role that we play is of managers, of curators, as much as we do the design. It's also these other roles that kind of set the stage for the project and allow it to begin to move forward.
Do you find there's much difference between the public versus a private sponsorship in your projects?
Well, it's an interesting question. We were talking a little bit on the plane up here. For us, this space is very public. Even though the university was building it and paying for it and all that, it very much existed within the public realm at this important crossroads where not just students and faculty and administrators were moving through it, Cambridge residents were moving through it, visitors to Cambridge and Harvard were moving through it. And so in that sense, it really was a public space. We weren't just thinking about how is it that we accommodate some of the university's folks and some of the university's agendas, but how is it that this space can be thought of as serving the multiple populations of people that are moving through or could be moving through, could really participate in that space. I mean, for us, the more people, the more agents that we get active within a public space, the better it is, right? The more active it's going to be, the more diverse, the more robust, the more fun it's going to be.
Can I just add something to that? I think that projects like this cut right to the heart of how public is a university campus. So and one of the reasons why I think there were no places to stop before was that there was a sense that the only way to keep Harvard private was to keep it all inside. And that but on the other hand, it is a major tourist stop. We have buses, tourist buses coming all year round with tourists from all over the world. But the message to them was you could look, but you can't stay. You can walk through, but keep moving. So when we came up with these ideas, starting with the tables and chairs that we put all through the campus, there were people who were horrified and very worried that we were inviting people into what should be a private space. Our view was, it already is. These people are there. What would be so terrible if somebody considered Harvard Yard to be a semi-public park? And in fact, it's been really wonderful. From April through October, even into early November, the tables and chairs are now out. And you see all kinds of people. And you see the students sitting there with their computers doing their work. You see, parents with young children. You see tourists coming through. It's great. But there was a lot of I think, anxiety around what's public and what's private. So
that leads me to my next question. There's so much discussion these days about public space. I mean, it's in the air, ranging from projects like the one along the Mississippi to New York City, all the transformations here, to the little interstitial spaces, to the third of an acre space you showed us, as well as to places like Wall Street and Occupy Wall Street movement. Is there change in our way of thinking about these spaces, and including the public?
We were talking again about this topic on the way up here. I presented this project 4 days ago in Gerald Caden's class. Gerald is a planner at Harvard. He's trained as an attorney. But he's written a book on, what's it called?
Well, it's
Privately
basically
held
about,
public
you know,
space.
right, publicly used private spaces, or the other way, but it's
and
those.
his case study was Manhattan, all the plazas that are in front of or around some of the bigger buildings. And he's done some real work on how is it that what we think of now as public space is actually privately owned. And that whole relationship. In fact, I saw him give a talk on the occupation. And what was interesting is the plaza that was occupied was a privately owned public space. And because of the rules for that space, as opposed to the rules for public parks, the occupiers were allowed to occupy, whereas if they had been in a public space, they wouldn't have been a publicly owned public space, they wouldn't have been allowed to occupy. And so there are all these kind of technicalities to it. For us, we kind of just, we look at it in a much broader way. I mean, in the same way that we're looking at the Minneapolis project to say, yes, we understand the city has one set of agendas, but when you're working in a city, there are many other agendas that are at stake too. How is it that we can reach out to some of those people to begin to inform and activate the spaces and the projects that we're doing? How is it that we even think about this from a technical standpoint. How do we reutilize a waste resource? How is it that we embed a design strategy that might qualify the project for some other kind of funding mechanism, so that we're really thinking more broadly about how to bring that space to life and how to bring it to fruition.
Suddenly, like all these cities are finding spaces, expanding the city without expanding the footprint at all. It's just optimizing the existing spaces that are there. I know we could keep talking amongst ourselves, but there's an audience here, and I would love to take questions. So before you ask your question, if you could just wait till you're past the microphone.
Well, just picking up exactly on what you just said is, how do you create a space or an agenda or a system that will survive, for want of a better example, the next administration? Mm-hmm. You know, if the next president of Harvard thinks you should privatize, you know, what we've seen in New York, a lot of what's changed has been driven in part by the vision of an administration, you know, who walked in and said, oh, what's this Gates project that they hated? Isn't that cool? Let's bring it back up off the shelf. Or of a DOT commissioner who says, we've got streets, we need bikes, you know, whatever, you know, whether you plus or minus. But these are really long range, and how do you design so that they can't be killed?
Yeah, I mean, there's an insidious piece to what we do too. Is, I mean, already within an hour of the wrapping coming off the benches, people are using it, right? People start to utilize a space like that. People start to value a space. You're not going to be able to shut a space like that down. So it begins to have a life of its own, which I think is really important.
Yeah, and with the
right. Well, in that case, that's where we're being very strategic about the various funding mechanisms and even potential implementers. So when we're a project like that, we're developing strategies that in part could be implemented by a city administration, but might also be sponsored by other nonprofit and even private entities as a way to move forward. So the more players you get involved in a project, if an administration changes, some of these other players can carry other balls and keep portions of the projects moving forward. In that way, it's a kind of survival strategy that we try to build into the project.
I just want to reinforce this idea of the claims that users make, I think, on space and how powerful they are. So when there were objections about, oh, these chairs you're going to put in the great Harvard yard, going, you know, nope, there's never been anything like that. It's going to be ruined. This is, you know, and then when we put the chairs out, within hours, the students had just turned the yard into their living room. They were there with their computers. They set up all their stuff. They were moving the chairs around. They were in classes. They were sitting there at night, just talking. They just made it their own so quickly. So when we turned this on, I guess you got a text message from someone in your office who had noticed, this was just this afternoon, that they had taken off these tarps that were over the benches. And when I went this morning, they were all covered. I was telling Chris it looked like coffins, just lined up. They took the tarps off, and within minutes, the students were on them. And, there was that picture of the administrators sitting on the benches that Chris showed. And, people look really awkward about, like, how do I sit on this? Particularly a few of these people we know just weren't sure. Your staff person was fine. He put his feet up, but he's young. The older people weren't sure what to do. But within minutes of the students getting on that stuff, they just filled it with their bodies in just the way you had hoped they would. So I said to Chris, this is so great that it's opened a few days earlier, and by the time we get to Friday at 1 o'clock, the students will have made it their own, and anybody who's going to object is going to be silenced by all the evidence that's there about how much we've already incorporated this into the way people live at Harvard.
I want to ask a question. I could probably project it. I want to ask a question about the relationship between means and ends in the design process, and the Harvard project is probably a good context in which to ask that. So obviously, you and your firm came up with some very creative ideas. I mean, I've been walking in parks for years, and I'd never thought of, you could have different kinds of benches. So once you have some creativity in the design of means, it seems that your clients might discover that they have new ends. Could you speak to that? Did that happen? How did that unfold when the clients discovered, there are goals that could be achieved that I hadn't even thought about?
Yeah, in fact, this was a great process, because even at the starting point for when we became engaged in the project, some of the goals were quite modest from a budgetary standpoint, and also from some of the ambition of the work that you guys had done was very, very clear, but it had yet to be tested fully about how much of that kind of activity and program could really fit into that space. There was also something I think that came out more through the discussion than in the planning work, is not just a space for the events and the performances and the activity, but also this need to accommodate the everyday. And I remember you in particular talking very strongly about that. The need to make sure that this is an active space on a day-to-day basis, even when those activities aren't present. And so the program really evolved, I'd say, over the course of 6, 8, 12 months through these discussions, through some of the testing work that we were doing. And, we had to argue at certain points that some kinds of activities just couldn't be accommodated here. We had to think through, what is the implication of some of those programs? There were some folks who wanted a green campus setting, and in fact, the level of activity that was being proposed simply couldn't be accommodated on no matter what kind of reinforced high-tech lawn that we could develop. It wasn't going to be able to survive that kind of impact. And so there were a lot of discussions back and forth about what the place was going to be. Never mind, I don't know how many designs we went through. I mean, a lot of designs.
The period when it was going to be like a deck. It was going to be all wood, this surface.
And this was what was nice about having an incredibly thoughtful design review committee involved. So it's not just that we were answering to some of the university administration, but we had a design review committee that was incredibly supportive of being thoughtful both about what we were doing as social space, but what we were doing as a kind of piece of good design. And so in a lot of ways, you guys, I think, really elevated the conversation about design on campus and how good contemporary design can play an important role as a complement to some of the historic resources that are there, and as a facilitator of some of the new social programs that the university was trying to foster.
One of the things I'm most excited about watching is that over time we moved to this idea that there would be kind of a mixture of these permanent benches, and then, as I mentioned to you, lighter tables and chairs, particularly chairs that could be brought over and by people to make spaces. So say you have a section of a class of 12 students, you could bring chairs over and use the benches and create kind of a semicircle for the students. You could have a singing group, or you could do you can move it around, you can make it work for you. That took time to get to that, because at first we were very focused on controlling the space completely ourselves. And then we had lots of debates about how many benches. And then I was always on the side of wanting lots of seating, because I wanted to be sure that this accommodated many different kinds of people on campus. And then there were other people who thought it would not be elegant enough if there was too much of that. So we ultimately compromised on this, some of it would be portable and people could control the use of it. And I think that's going to make it very exciting.
Yeah. We also did a lot of testing of program. And this is, again, this was a treat to be able to work with the university to schedule events out on the site while we were in design, so that we could be better informed about configuration, sizes, types of activities that would work or wouldn't work, and where they might best be accommodated. And so there was a year, really, where Lisa Hogarty really championed a whole set of performances. She had, in fact, what was the ART?
It was the Woody Guthrie show that they brought some of there to perform.
Right.
Yeah.
So we had professional performers out on the site. We had student performers. We had impromptu events, and all that allowed us to really test some of these programmatic and activity ideas while we were designing to better accommodate these things.
I thought of a really good example of what you were saying about how we got the institution to change. When we first started out, we wanted to have food, interesting food available around campus, and we were told, just, very clearly, forget it. There could be no food other than food services, because they have the contract, they have the monopoly, and when we kept pushing and pushing, we were then told, okay, food services will do ethnic booths around near the yard, on the fringes of the yard, and over by the Science Center. So for the first fall, we had food services trying to do Greek food services trying to do these various things. It was awful. So then we got this Lisa Hogarty, who came from Columbia, from New York, knew about food trucks. We knew about them too, but most of them were over at MIT, not at Harvard, because we didn't allow them on Harvard, because there was a campus, there's a monopoly to food services. And she just said, that's ridiculous. And she let the food trucks, as this design was going on, she let them come onto that pathetic, wasn't even a plaza, what did we have? I mean, the wreck that this space was. But she let them drive on, and all of a sudden we saw how people were coming out of the woodwork to buy interesting food. And so that was a kind of a process that we went through. And now, of course, they designed this so the trucks can drive on it, and they'll be there.
Well, I hate to cut it here, but I hope that you've all enjoyed the last hour and a half as much as I have. I think it's been a really good insight into the design process. And all the iterations, and fortunately with very beautiful outcomes. So good luck, and have to go up and see it. Thank you very much for coming.